The day I lost my son began with a phone call. "Mom, I can't make it to dinner tonight. Rebecca and I have wedding plans to discuss." I gripped the phone tighter, swallowing my disappointment. My name is Eleanor, and this was the third time this month that my son, James, had canceled our standing Thursday dinner. For 30 years, ever since my husband passed away, those dinners had been sacred, until Rebecca came into the picture. "Of course, sweetheart." "I understand," I lied, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. "Wedding planning is important." "Thanks, Mom. You're the best." The relief in his voice was palpable. "Rebecca says hi." I doubted that very much. In the year since James had brought her home, all designer clothes and practiced smiles, she'd made it clear that I was an inconvenience. A relic to be tolerated, not embraced. "Give her my regards," I said, keeping my tone light. "Maybe next week?" "Definitely," James promised, though we both knew it was empty. "Love you, Mom." After hanging up, I stared at the pot of his favorite beef stew I'd spent the morning preparing. Another meal I'd eat alone. At 65, I wasn't naive. I understood that when children grow up, they build their own lives. Their own families. But this felt different. This felt like Rebecca was systematically removing me from my son's life, one canceled dinner at a time. I was putting the stew into containers when my phone rang again. It was Marianne, my closest friend since college. "Let me guess," she said when I answered. "Dinner's canceled again?" "Wedding planning," I sighed, sinking into a kitchen chair. "That's the third time this month, Ellie." "I'm counting." "And you're just going to accept it?" Marianne's voice held the gentle challenge I'd come to expect from her. "When are you going to admit there's something off about that girl?" I pinched the bridge of my nose, fighting off the headache that seemed to accompany any discussion of Rebecca. "What would you have me do? Tell my son I think his fiancée is manipulating him away from me? He'd think I was a jealous old woman who couldn't let go." "Or maybe he'd realize you might be right," Marianne countered. James was never the type to miss those dinners. Not even when he was seeing that doctor girl. What was her name? "Allison," I supplied. Allison, who had been kind and thoughtful and whom James had dated for 3 years before she took a residency on the opposite coast. Allison, who would never have dreamed of coming between James and me. Right, Allison. Even with their schedules, he made time for Thursday dinners. "This Rebecca thing, it's different, and you know it." I did know it. But what could I say? That I'd noticed how Rebecca's smile never reached her eyes when she looked at me? That I'd caught her rolling her eyes behind James's back when I spoke? That she seemed to call or text with some emergency every time James and I were alone together? "I just need to give it time," I said, more to convince myself than Marianne. "Once they're married, things will settle down." Marianne's silence spoke volumes. "Anyway," I continued brightly, "I've got plenty to keep me busy. The garden club meets tomorrow, and I'm helping with the church food drive on Saturday." "Ellie." Marianne's voice softened. "It's okay to be worried. It's okay to be hurt." The tears I'd been holding back spilled over. "He's all I have, Mari. After Richard died, raising James became my whole world. And now some blonde with expensive tastes is taking him away," Marianne finished. "I get it. But you listen to me, Eleanor Mitchell. You are not just James's mother. You're smart, kind, and stronger than you give yourself credit for. If this girl is up to something, we'll figure it out." After we hung up, I stared at the photo on my refrigerator door, James at his college graduation, his arm around me, both of us beaming with pride. That had been 6 years ago, before he'd landed the job at the prestigious architecture firm, before he'd met Rebecca at some fancy charity gala. Before everything changed. I picked up my phone and scrolled to Rebecca's number. We'd never been close, but maybe it was time for me to make more of an effort. Perhaps if I reached out directly, showed her I wanted to be part of their lives. Before I could overthink it, I pressed call. Eleanor, she answered on the 4th ring, her voice cool. No hello, no warmth. Just my name, like an accusation. Rebecca, hi, I said, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. James and I are actually in the middle of something, she replied. Was there something you needed? In the background, I could hear music and laughter. Not the serious wedding planning I'd imagined. Since dinner was cancelled, I thought maybe I could drop off some of the stew I made. James's favorite. I could leave it on the porch if you're busy. There was a pause, then muffled talking as if she'd covered the phone with her hand. That's not necessary, she said when she returned. We're actually heading out to dinner with friends. But thanks for the offer. More laughter in the background. A woman's voice called something about hurrying up. Of course, I said, my heart sinking. Another time, then. Sure, Rebecca replied, clearly distracted. Look, I need to go. We'll talk soon, okay? The line went dead before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, as the truth washed over me. There was no urgent wedding planning. Just dinner with friends they hadn't wanted to include me in. The lie hurt more than the exclusion. Setting my phone down, I made a decision. I couldn't force my way into James's life. I couldn't make Rebecca like me. But I could stop pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Something was wrong, and it was time I figured out exactly what. The next morning, I woke with purpose. If Rebecca was methodically cutting me out of my son's life, I needed to understand why. Was it simple jealousy? A need for control? Or was there something more sinister at play? I called Marianne as I made my coffee. I need your help with something, I said when she answered. Finally, she replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Operation Save James from the Blonde Barracuda is a go. Mari, be serious. I am serious. Dead serious. What's the plan? I hesitated. I think I need to learn more about Rebecca. Her background. Where she came from before she met James. You mean aside from the 7th circle of hell? Marianne. Sorry. Go on. I took a deep breath. James met her at that charity gala for the Children's Hospital, right? The one his firm designed the new wing for. She was supposedly on the planning committee. Supposedly? Marianne's interest was piqued. I looked up the event online. There are photos from the planning committee meetings, and she's not in any of them. She told James she was the co-chair, but her name isn't even listed. Marianne was quiet for a moment. That's odd. It gets odder. Remember how she said she graduated from Wellesley? I checked their alumni directory. No Rebecca Collins graduated in the last 10 years. Ellie, have you been cyberstalking your future daughter-in-law? Marianne sounded more impressed than scandalized. I prefer to call it research, I replied. And there's more. She told James she worked at the Harrington Gallery downtown before they met. When I called to inquire about a piece I was interested in, I asked for her by name. They'd never heard of her. Holy shit, Marianne whispered. You think she's lying about her entire past? I don't know what to think, I admitted. But something's not adding up, and I'm worried about James. Have you tried telling him any of this? I sighed. And sound like the bitter mother who can't let go. He's completely besotted with her. He'd never believe me without concrete proof. Then we get proof, Marianne declared. I have a friend whose son is a private investigator. Very discreet. Let me make a call. 2 days later, I met with Cameron, Marianne's PI contact, at a quiet cafe several towns over. He was younger than I expected, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. Mrs. Mitchell, he greeted me, standing as I approached his table. Marianne speaks highly of you. Thank you for meeting with me, I said, sliding into the booth. I realize this is an unusual request. Not as unusual as you might think, he replied with a small smile. You'd be surprised how many people want background checks on their children's partners. Cameron listened attentively as I explained the situation, the inconsistencies in Rebecca's backstory, the sudden changes in James's behavior, my growing concerns. So you want me to look into her past, he summarized when I finished. Find out who she really is and what she might be after. Yes, I said, feeling simultaneously relieved and guilty. I know it sounds invasive, but I'm worried about my son. Cameron nodded. I understand. I'll need some basic information to start, her full name, date of birth if you know it, current address, phone number, places she's claimed to work or study. Any photos you have would also be helpful. I slid an envelope across the table. It's all in here. Including the retainer Marianne mentioned. He accepted it with a nod. I'll be in touch within a week. In the meantime, try to maintain normalcy. If she's as calculating as you suspect, she'll notice any changes in your behavior. As I left the cafe, I felt a weight both lifting from and settling onto my shoulders. I was taking action, yes, but crossing a line I never thought I would. Spying on my son's fiancée felt wrong, no matter how justified my concerns might be. But when I checked my phone and saw another canceled dinner, this time with a text rather than even a call, the guilt receded. Something was very wrong in James's life, and if he couldn't see it, then it was up to me to open his eyes. I just hoped I wasn't already too late. 5 days later, Cameron called. Mrs. Mitchell, I have some information I think you'll want to hear in person. Are you available to meet today? My heart raced. Yes. Same place? 2 o'clock. And Mrs. Mitchell? You might want to bring someone with you for support. I called Marianne immediately. He found something. When we arrived at the cafe, Cameron was already waiting, a thick folder on the table before him. His expression was grave as he greeted us. Mrs. Mitchell, thank you for coming. He nodded to Marianne. And you must be the friend. Marianne Davies, she introduced herself. Eleanor filled me in. What did you find? Cameron gestured for us to sit. It's complicated. And frankly, concerning. He opened the folder and removed several documents. Rebecca Collins isn't her real name. She was born Rebecca Mercer in a small town in Nevada. She has a history of attaching herself to wealthy men, usually ones in vulnerable positions, recently divorced, widowed, or in your son's case, someone with a close but potentially exploitable relationship with a parent. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? Cameron pushed a police report across the table. 3 years ago, she was living with a man named Edward Daniels in Portland. He was a successful business owner, recently divorced. His ex-wife filed this report after Rebecca convinced Edward to transfer company assets to her name, then disappeared with nearly $500,000. "Oh my God," Marianne breathed. "Charges were never filed," Cameron continued, because Edward was too embarrassed to admit he'd been conned. "Classic case of a romance scam." "But that's not all," he said, sliding over more papers. Before Edward, there was Thomas Lee in San Francisco. Similar situation, wealthy man, recently estranged from his family. She was with him for 8 months, engaged for 3 of them, before she emptied their joint accounts and vanished. The room seemed to tilt. "And James?" I asked, barely able to form the words. "What's her plan with my son?" Cameron's expression softened with sympathy. Based on her pattern, she isolates her targets from family support systems, pushes for joint finances, then waits for the right moment to clean them out. The wedding is likely a means to an end. Once they're married, she'll have legal access to his assets. Marianne reached for my hand, squeezing tightly. "That manipulative little." "We need to tell James," I interrupted. "Right away." "I would advise caution," Cameron said. "People in these situations often don't want to believe they've been deceived. If you approach this wrong, he might cut you off completely, which is exactly what she wants." "So what do I do?" I asked, desperation rising. "Wait until she's taken everything from him?" "No." Cameron's voice was firm. "But you need evidence he can't dismiss. Something tangible." He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo of Rebecca, except her hair was dark, not blonde, emerging from a bank with a man who wasn't James. The timestamp was from 2 days ago. She's still in contact with her previous target, the one from Portland. They met at this bank, and afterwards, she made a substantial cash deposit into an account that isn't connected to your son. I stared at the image, my worst fears confirmed. This woman was systematically destroying my son's life, and he had no idea. "I need to call him," I said, reaching for my phone. Cameron placed his hand over mine. "Mrs. Mitchell, I strongly advise against that. Men like your son, intelligent, successful, proud, they need to see the evidence themselves. Otherwise, they'll rationalize it away." "What do you suggest?" Marianne asked. "I've tracked Rebecca's movements for the past week. She has a pattern. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, she tells your son she's meeting her wedding planner, but she's actually meeting different men. I suspect these are previous or potential targets." "Tomorrow is Thursday," I realized. Cameron nodded. "Here's what I propose." The next day found me sitting in Marianne's car outside an upscale hotel downtown, my stomach in knots. According to Cameron, Rebecca had scheduled a meeting here at 2 p.m., supposedly with her wedding planner, but his surveillance indicated otherwise. "Are you sure about this?" Marianne asked, scanning the hotel entrance. "We could still let Cameron handle it." "I need to see for myself," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And James needs to hear it from me." At precisely 1:55, a sleek black car pulled up to the valet stand. Rebecca emerged, looking immaculate in a blue dress I recognized as one James had bought her for her birthday. The sight of it made my blood boil. "There she is," Marianne whispered unnecessarily. "Right on schedule." Rebecca entered the hotel, not once glancing around, confident no one who knew her would see. "Now we wait," I said, settling in. At 2:10, another car arrived. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit stepped out, handed his keys to the valet, and strode into the hotel with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. That's him, I said, recognizing the man from Cameron's photos. Edward Daniels, the Portland businessman Rebecca had scammed before moving on to my son. Marianne squeezed my hand. Ready? I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. We waited 5 minutes, then entered the hotel. Cameron had provided the room number, a suite on the 12th floor, reserved under Daniel's name. The elevator ride felt eternal. In the hallway outside room 1214, I hesitated, my hand poised to knock. What if we're wrong? I whispered. What if there's an explanation? Marianne's expression was uncharacteristically gentle. Ellie, you know there isn't. We've seen the evidence. Now James needs to see it too. I took a deep breath and knocked firmly. Silence. Then footsteps. The door swung open to reveal Rebecca, her cheeks flushed, her usually perfect hair slightly mussed. She froze when she saw me, shock giving way to anger on her face. Eleanor? What are you? Where's James? I asked, pushing past her into the suite. Is he here? Of course not, she snapped, recovering quickly. I'm meeting with my wedding planner. From the bedroom doorway, a man's voice called out, Becca? Who is it? Rebecca's face drained of color. The man, Edward Daniels, appeared, his shirt half unbuttoned, looking confused. Who are these people? Edward Daniels, I said, my voice ice cold. We know all about your history with Rebecca. Or should I call her Rebecca Mercer? Rebecca's expression morphed from shock to calculated calm. Eleanor, you've clearly misunderstood something. Edward is an old friend who's helping with some wedding investments for James and me. Save it, Marianne snapped. We've seen the bank records, honey. We know exactly what kind of investments you're making. Edward looked between us, realization dawning. Are you related to her new Mark? New Mark? I repeated, though I knew exactly what he meant. You mean my son? The man she's planning to marry in 3 weeks? Edward's face hardened. Becca, you promised me you were done with this. You said the money was for a fresh start for us. Rebecca backed away, eyes darting between us. Eddie, they're lying. They're trying to come between us, just like I told you her type would. Her type? I advanced on her, fury overriding fear. You mean a mother who loves her son enough to protect him from predators like you? Rebecca's demeanor changed instantly, her vulnerability replaced by cold calculation. You have no idea what you're dealing with, old woman. James believes everything I tell him. One word from me, and you'll never see him again. The threat hung in the air between us. You think James will believe you over me? Rebecca laughed, a cold sound devoid of any real humor. I've spent a year making sure he sees you as a clingy, desperate mother who can't let go. Who do you think he'll choose? The truth, I said, but my voice wavered. Once he sees who you really are. He'll see what I want him to see, she cut in, gathering her purse. This little ambush was a mistake, Eleanor. A big one. Becca, Edward moved toward her, his expression hardening. Don't walk away from me again. We had a deal. Deal's off, Eddie, she snapped. Thanks to Mommy Dearest here. As she pushed past me toward the door, I grabbed her arm. You're not going anywhere until we call James. Together. He deserves to hear the truth from all of us. Her eyes met mine, cold as ice. Take your hand off me, or I'll tell James you physically assaulted me. Who do you think he'll believe? The mother who's been acting strange lately, or his loving fiancé who just wants everyone to get along? Marianne stepped between us. We have evidence, Rebecca. Photos, bank records, police reports. Your whole history. How many men have you scammed? 3? 4? Uncertainty flickered across Rebecca's face. You're bluffing. Call her bluff, Edward suggested, his voice bitter. I've got nothing to lose anymore. Rebecca's phone chimed with a text. She glanced at it, and something in her expression changed. Fine, she said, with a chilling smile. Let's call James right now. She hit a button on her phone and put it on speaker. James answered on the second ring. Hey, babe. Everything okay with the planner? Rebecca's transformation was instantaneous. Her voice broke as she responded, James, thank God. You need to come to the Westbrook Hotel. Room 1214. Your mother, she's gone crazy. What? The alarm in his voice made my stomach clench. What are you talking about? Are you okay? She followed me to my wedding planning meeting, Rebecca continued, tears now streaming down her face. She broke in with some woman, screaming about scams and threatening me. There's a strange man here too. I'm scared, James. I'm on my way, he said immediately. Stay on the phone with me. Hurry, she whispered, her eyes locked on mine in a silent challenge. After she hung up, the act dropped immediately. She wiped her tears with clinical efficiency. And that, she said, is how it's done. Marianne looked stunned. You manipulative little. Save it, Rebecca interrupted. James will be here in about 15 minutes, assuming traffic is light. That gives you two choices, leave now and hope I don't completely poison him against you, or stay and watch as he chooses me. Again. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. You can't possibly think you'll get away with this. I already have, she replied, settling gracefully onto the suite's sofa. Edward, be a dear and fix me a drink. This has been rather exhausting. Edward didn't move. I want my money back, Becca. She laughed. Get in line. I looked between them, realization dawning. You're not even trying to deny it anymore. Why bother? She shrugged. In about 10 minutes, James will rush in here to save his damsel in distress. I'll tell him his unstable mother has been stalking me, making wild accusations because she can't accept that she's not the most important woman in his life anymore. She examined her manicure. By tonight, you'll be cut out completely. Just in time for me to suggest we elope. Much more romantic, don't you think? The casual cruelty of her plan left me speechless. This woman had systematically isolated my son, manipulated him, and was now planning to take everything from him, his money, his family, his trust. You don't love him at all, do you? I whispered. Something genuine flickered across her face, not remorse, but perhaps a shadow of what might have been regret. Love is overrated, she said finally. Security is what matters, and your son is my ticket to that. Although I have to say, he made it almost too easy. So desperate for someone to take care of, now that mommy's supposed to be letting go. Her words struck a painful chord. Had I raised James to be vulnerable to someone like her? Had my own grief after losing his father made him an easier target? Marianne must have sensed my spiraling thoughts. She gripped my hand tight. Don't you dare blame yourself, she hissed. This is all on her. Edward poured himself a drink from the suite's minibar, ignoring Rebecca's earlier request. For what it's worth, he said to me, they never do love us. That's the hardest part to accept. He lifted his glass in a mock toast to Rebecca. She's incredibly good at making you feel like you're the only person in the world who truly understands her. Rebecca rolled her eyes. Oh, please. The pity party is tedious, Eddie. My phone buzzed in my purse. Cameron. James just pulled up to the hotel. He's moving fast. Whatever you're planning to do, do it now. Time was running out. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. How could I make James see the truth when Rebecca had so thoroughly twisted everything? Then I remembered the folder. The evidence Cameron had gathered. Marianne, I said urgently. The folder. Where is it? In my car, she replied, eyes widening. I'll never make it down and back in time. Rebecca's smile widened. Tick-tock. Edward watched this exchange with growing interest. Then, surprisingly, he pulled out his phone. I have pictures, he said quietly. Of the money transfers. Of Rebecca, with our bank statements. Will that help? Rebecca's smile vanished. You wouldn't dare. Watch me, he replied, his voice hard. You took everything from me, Becca. My business, my savings, my self-respect. I was too embarrassed to press charges then. Not anymore. He tapped on his phone, then held it out to me. Here. Take it. Rebecca lunged for the phone. Don't you dare. As we struggled, the hotel room door burst open. Rebecca. James stood in the doorway, his face pale with fear and confusion. He took in the scene, Rebecca grappling with Edward, me standing nearby, Marianne by my side. Rebecca immediately released Edward and ran to James, throwing herself into his arms. James, thank God, she sobbed. They've been terrorizing me. Your mother's lost her mind. James held her, his expression hardening as he looked at me over her shoulder. Mom? What the hell is going on? This was the moment. My last chance to save my son from this woman who would destroy him. James, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. You need to see something. I held out Edward's phone, the screen still showing the damning photos and bank statements. Don't, Rebecca hissed, clinging tighter to James. She's been acting crazy for weeks. This is just another attempt to come between us. James looked torn, his arms still around Rebecca even as his eyes moved to the phone in my hand. She's not who you think she is, son, I said softly. Her real name is Rebecca Mercer. She's done this before, attached herself to wealthy men, isolated them from their families, then disappeared with their money. That's ridiculous, Rebecca spat. James, please, let's just go. These people are insane. But James was looking at Edward now. Who are you? Edward straightened his shirt. Edward Daniels. Rebecca's previous target. She took me for almost $500,000 3 years ago. He's lying, Rebecca insisted. I've never seen this man before today. Then why were you in a hotel room with him? James asked, his voice dangerously quiet as he finally stepped back from her embrace. Rebecca's eyes darted between us. Your mother set this up. She's framing me. The photos on his phone, I pressed. The bank records. The police report. It's all there, James. James hesitated, his eyes moving from Rebecca's tear-stained face to my desperate one, and I could see him wrestling with what to believe. Show me, he finally said, extending his hand for the phone. Rebecca grabbed his arm. James, no. She's manipulating you. She's trying to control you like she always has. But James gently removed her hand. Let me see, Rebecca. If there's nothing to hide, there's nothing to worry about. I handed him the phone, my heart in my throat. For 5 endless minutes, James scrolled through Edward's evidence, photos of Rebecca with him, bank statements showing massive transfers, screenshots of texts where she'd outlined their investment strategy. Finally, he looked up, his face ashen. "Is this real?" he asked Edward. Edward nodded grimly. "Every bit of it. I was too ashamed to press charges when she disappeared with my money. But it was all real." James turned to Rebecca, who had abandoned her tears and now stood straight, her expression calculating. "Rebecca?" Her laugh was hollow. "Are you seriously asking me this? After everything we've been through? You're choosing your jealous mother over me?" "I'm asking for the truth," James said, his voice breaking slightly. "Because right now, the evidence is telling me I don't know you at all." Rebecca's demeanor changed instantly. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by cold fury. "Fine," she snapped. "You want the truth?" "The truth is you were an easy mark, James. Devoted son with a needy mother and a successful career. So desperate for someone to take care of that you never questioned anything. Not my background, not my convenient schedule, not even how I could afford my lifestyle before I met you." The color drained from James's face as she continued. "Do you know how easy it was to come between you and Mommy? A few well-timed emergencies during your precious Thursday dinners. Some comments about how she still treats you like a child. You were so eager to prove your independence that you did all the work for me." Each word was a knife, but I couldn't bring myself to interrupt. James needed to hear this, all of it. "So yes," Rebecca continued, gathering her purse. "It was all a lie. Every single word. And you fell for it completely." The silence that followed was deafening. James stood frozen, as if physically struck by her confession. Then, quietly, "Get out." Rebecca smiled thinly. "Gladly. But don't think this is over." As she brushed past him toward the door, she paused. "By the way, the ring was fake. Just like everything else." With that parting shot, she was gone, leaving behind the wreckage of what would have been the biggest mistake of my son's life. James sank onto the sofa, his head in his hands. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I am so sorry." I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around his shoulders as he began to shake with silent sobs. My strong, confident son, reduced to this by a woman who had never cared for him at all. "It's all right," I soothed, though we both knew it wasn't. "It's going to be all right." Marianne quietly suggested she and Edward give us some space. As they stepped outside, I held my son as he hadn't let me hold him since he was a child. "I didn't see it," he kept saying. "How did I not see it?" "Because she didn't want you to," I said simply. "It's what people like her do." James looked up, his eyes red. "But you saw it. From the beginning." "Mothers have a different perspective," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "It's easier to spot someone who doesn't have your best interests at heart when you've spent your whole life putting those interests first." He took a shuddering breath. The Thursday dinners. She always had some crisis. And I fell for it every time. "She was isolating you," I said gently. "It's what these people do. They cut you off from your support system. Make you dependent on them alone." "Did you know?" he asked suddenly. "Is that why you were so distant with her?" I considered my answer carefully. I didn't know exactly what she was doing. But I knew something wasn't right. The way she'd roll her eyes when you weren't looking. The convenient emergencies. The inconsistencies in her stories. James nodded slowly. I thought you were just having trouble letting go. That's what she said, that you couldn't accept I was building my own life. The manipulation was so clear now, laid bare by Rebecca's own confession. I've only ever wanted you to be happy, James, I said softly. Even if that happiness didn't include weekly dinners with your old mother. He hugged me fiercely. I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I chose her. You didn't know, I reassured him. And you didn't really choose her over me. She manipulated the situation so that it seemed that way. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had almost happened settling between us. What do we do now? James finally asked. First, I said, standing and offering him my hand, we go home. Then tomorrow, you call the bank and check your accounts. And then we call the police. She's done this before, and she'll do it again if we don't stop her. James accepted my hand, rising from the sofa. And then Thursday dinner? Despite everything, I smiled. And then Thursday dinner. As we left the hotel room, Edward Daniels stepped forward from where he'd been waiting in the hallway. I'm sorry, he said to James. About all of this. I know what you're feeling right now. James nodded stiffly. Thank you. For the evidence. For coming forward. I should have done it years ago, Edward replied. Might have saved you from this. Well, James managed a weak smile, better late than never, I suppose. As we rode the elevator down, Marianne squeezed my hand. You did it, Ellie. You saved him. I shook my head. We did it. I couldn't have done this without you. But looking at James's haunted expression, I knew the battle was only half won. Rebecca had left him with scars that would take time to heal, trust broken, confidence shattered, heart betrayed. The real work of recovery was just beginning. 3 months later, I set the table for Thursday dinner, smiling as I heard James's key in the front door. Something smells amazing, he called, hanging up his coat. Beef stew, I replied. Your favorite. He appeared in the dining room doorway, holding a bottle of wine. And I brought dessert. Mrs. Wilson's apple pie from that bakery you love. I accepted both offerings with a smile. Perfect. How was work? Good. He helped me finish setting the table, a routine we'd fallen back into with comfortable familiarity. The Portland project is finally coming together. And I've been asked to lead the team for the new library design. That's wonderful. I beamed with genuine pride. They obviously recognize your talent. He shrugged, but I could see he was pleased. Maybe. Though sometimes I think they're just being nice because of everything. The shadow of Rebecca still lingered even months later. The police had opened an investigation after James and Edward both filed charges, but Rebecca had disappeared, just as she had after her previous scams. The engagement ring, fake, as she'd claimed, had been left behind on James's kitchen counter, along with a note simply reading, "Better luck next time." The wine she had insisted they pre-purchase for the wedding had turned out to be cheap bottles with expensive labels glued on. The venue deposits, the photographer, the caterer, none of them existed. All the money James had given her for wedding expenses had vanished into offshore accounts. They're recognizing your talent, I insisted, filling our wine glasses. The Rebecca chapter is closed. James nodded, though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. The police called yesterday. They think they might have a lead on her whereabouts. I paused in serving the stew. Really? Where? Miami. He accepted his bowl with a murmured thanks. Apparently, she's already cozying up to some real estate developer. I shook my head. Some people never change. No, James agreed. But some people do. He raised his glass in a small toast. I've learned who really matters. We ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the beef stew warming us on the chilly autumn evening. You know, James said suddenly, I was thinking about what you said when all this happened. About how mothers have a different perspective. I nodded, encouraging him to continue. You said it's easier to spot someone who doesn't have your best interests at heart when you've spent your whole life putting those interests first. He met my eyes. I never really thanked you for that. For always putting me first. My throat tightened with emotion. You don't need to thank me for that, James. That's what love is. I know, he said quietly. That's what I didn't see with Rebecca. She never put me first. Not once. And now you'll know better, I said gently. For next time. The corners of his mouth lifted slightly. Next time? You think there should be a next time after this disaster? When you're ready, I clarified. Someday. With someone worthy of you. He considered this, twirling his wine glass thoughtfully. Maybe. Though I think I'll introduce her to you first next time. Get the Eleanor Mitchell seal of approval before I let myself get too invested. I laughed. I think that's wise. As we continued our dinner, trading stories about our weeks and planning a weekend visit to Marianne's lake house, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road had been difficult, the battle painful, but we had emerged stronger. My son had been returned to me, not as a child to be protected, but as an adult who had learned a hard lesson about trust and love. Rebecca had tried to take him from me, tried to destroy the bond we shared. In the end, she had only strengthened it. Outside, autumn leaves danced in the evening breeze, a reminder that even after the harshest seasons, renewal always comes. And for us, it had already begun.